Hello, my name is Mackenzie McCubbins, and this is my presentation on the Supreme Court case Rostker versus Goldberg from 1981. So first, what happened? What are the facts of this case? So after the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in early 1980, then President at the time Jimmy Carter reactivated the draft registration process. Congress ended up agreeing with Carter's decision, but did not support his recommendation that the Military Selective Service Act, or MSSA, be amended to include the registration of females. A number of men challenged the constitutionality of the Military Selective Service Act, and the challenge was sustained by a district court, and it eventually made its way to the Supreme Court. So, what question was the Supreme Court trying to answer here? Did the Military Selective Service Act gender distinctions violate the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment? Well, let's see what the Supreme Court had to say. The Supreme Court in a 6-3 decision ruled that Congress's decision to exempt women from registration was constitutional because it was not accidental. It was not the accidental byproduct of a traditional way of thinking about females, and it did not violate the Due Process Clause. The court argued that men and women, because of combat restrictions on women, were not similarly suited for the purpose of draft registration. The court also upheld Congress's judgment that the administrative and military problems that would be created by drafting women for non-combat roles were sufficient to justify the Military Selective Service Act. One thing to mention here, intermediate scrutiny was used here for a constitutional challenge to a law that creates a gender distinction, as other laws with gender distinctions are at. And just to include the stuff that we've read before, the law must be substantially related to an important government interest. While only men are affected by a draft, only men are eligible for combat. Another important distinction that the court made was that since the draft was mostly used to get combat related soldiers, that only men can fulfill that role and that women could not. Because at this time, women were not eligible to be in combat positions. They were able to go into the military, but they were in very limited positions. They weren't able to be infantrymen, for example. There's a couple dissents that I found interesting. Justice White, for example, did not think that excluding women offended the Constitution, but rather that Congress did not conclude that every position in the military, no matter how far removed from combat, must be filled with combat-ready men. So basically, I think he was trying to argue here that, women could still be included in the Selective Service Act, in the case of a draft, just to help fill other positions that are definitely needed in the military. Um, the military does a lot of things. Not everyone's just an infantryman. There's other complex jobs. There's cooks, there's mechanics, there's construction workers. There's pretty much anything you can think of under the sun is in the military too, besides just combat. Justice Marshall, he ended up dissenting on the principle of equal civic obligation. The way he saw it, men and women both have an equal civic obligation to take on this duty in the case of a draft happening, which I agree with Justice Marshall a lot here, but I can get the other arguments, especially considering the different time periods and the different gender stereotypes. So what was the significance of this case? There were no new tests that were created from this, but it does have a drastic impact on it has a drastic impact on how the difference between men and women. I think the court ruled the way that it did too, particularly in the 1980s, due to the fact that not a lot of women entered the military, so they didn't have a lot of evidence or support that perhaps women could perform at the same level that men could. If you ask me, I think this ruling sends a clear message. Um, Back in the day, I can kind of get their reasoning. You know, there are biological differences between men and women, and maybe there was a genuine concern that women just will not be suited to do well in combat. But looking at it in a modern day scenario, I think the message that it sends can be a pretty poor one. It's sending a message that women are weak and unable to serve. It also sends a message that perhaps maybe women's lives are inherently more valuable than men's, which I am not a huge fan of. So there's a lot of discussions to how this would potentially be ruled today. Because today women are actually able to go into any position in the military, even combat ones. So the Supreme Court's whole argument for preventing women to register for the Military Selective Service Act just doesn't hold up anymore. Do I think the Supreme Court's going to rule on it? Um, Considering some of the Supreme Court's rulings and their tendency to tiptoe around controversial issues, I don't think they're going to rule on it anytime soon. But this case really is kind of important to me because I myself served in the United States Army. I was a tank mechanic. I loved doing it. I loved working on tanks, but anyway, I think it would also be ruled differently today, simply due to the fact how much combat has changed. Um, Perhaps back in the 1980s, combat would be a little bit different. Perhaps you could make the argument that weapons were way heavier than they are now, but speaking from personal experience, any average woman could don the military gear, you know, your ACH, your IOTV, and an M4, and be perfectly capable of performing physical exercise and activities as needed for the job. I think that anyone has the ability to learn how to shoot as well. And again, combat has changed, so you don't even need I mean, you still need infantrymen, right? You still need boots on the ground. You still need people on the ground. But there's a plethora of other jobs that are definitely needed. You can operate a drone, you could be a mechanic, you can be a cook. There's lots of other jobs that are needed. Um, Personally, I don't think the Selective Service Act should still be a thing. I think our military is more than capable of handling anything, but I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon. So, with that being said, I think that women should be required to register for it as well as men. Um, like I said earlier, the messages that this pushes is that perhaps men's lives are just inherently less, not worth as much as women's lives because we're just forcing them to go into combat roles and be on the front lines. It's also insinuating that perhaps women are just weak and unable to complete the tasks of being in combat, and that's just simply not the case. That's my spiel. Thank you guys for watching. Here's my works cited. You guys have a good one.